So welcome everyone to the first of 4 seminars, online seminars funded by CRASSH entitled Beyond Cooking, Global Histories of Food Making and Gender Across the Early Modern Period. And this is a project that has been developed by Marta, Manzanares and me with CRASSH and also with some funding from the Trevelyan Fund. And it's a chance to go beyond cooking, to think about production, to think about the circulation of foodstuffs, and also to think about practices and knowledge in relation to gender in food history. And we've put together a program of speakers from across the disciplines and for the seminar series. And we've also organized a conference in May, which we hope you'll be able to attend either virtually or in person, and we'll send out the information later this term. So thank you very much for coming. And I would like to introduce our chair, Jakob Klein, who is the chair of the Food Studies Center at SOAS, someone I've known for quite a long time, actually, and also the convener of the MA in the Anthropology of Food at SOAS. And I'm really pleased that he's here because of his expertise in the field of East Asia, but also in food as well. I should just say a couple of things in terms of housekeeping. The expectation is that you keep your microphones off. You're very welcome to turn your cameras on. That we positively like that, but please don't feel obliged. As you can see, it's being recorded by Zoom and it will be live streamed. If you're not happy with this, then I guess you have to leave, but by attending the event, you're basically giving your consent to be included in the recording. And the recording will be available on the CRASSH website shortly after the event. If you're tweeting, you are asked to remember to tag CRASSH Live. And finally, captioning is available, and you can make the live captioning kind of link. There's a link on your screen. So I'll turn it over to Jakob, and thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you, Melissa and Marta, for inviting me to chair this session. It's a real honor to chair this session. These are two speakers, two scholars whose research, whose work I'm a strong admirer of. So it's a real privilege. What we're going to do today, so we have Veronica Mock and Miranda Brown with us today. We'll have one speaker speak first, and then we'll have a Q&A session after that. Veronica will speak first. So if I could ask you to, when you're asking your questions after the paper, if you could use the raise hand function at the bottoms of your screen in the first instance. If for whatever reason, technical or otherwise, you're not able to use the raise hand function and ask I will then call on you to ask your question. If you're not able to do that, you're not able to ask your question out loud and you'd rather write it down, then you can use the chat function for that, and I will be looking at your questions. But we'll do the Q&A after the papers. So, or after the first paper, we'll do the first Q&A. So our first speaker for today then is Professor Veronica Sau-wa, who is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the Hong Kong Xi'an University. Her research interests include food, heritage, and politics in China and Hong Kong. And she's the author of Milk Craze in China, Body, Science, and Hope, which was recently published last year by the University of Hawaii Press. And I haven't read it yet, but I am going to be ordering it immediately. So welcome, Veronica.
So thank you very much for Melissa and also Marta's invitations. I'm really honored to join this very meaningful conference. And I would like, I titled my today's topics as the brain and the body, because I would like to use the formula milk as a lens to understand the gender moral grammar of self-identity in modern China. So I start from the past, okay, and I'll talk about the present scenario. So I frame my discussions of today in two main areas, two questions. So first of all, how are the changing meanings and the ideas of milk, okay, in Chinese society? So I start with Chinese milk and then I will continue with the Western milk. How these meanings of milk change our understanding of our brain and our body. and the gendered moral roles of women in modern Chinese society. So these are the two main areas I would like to cover today. So first of all, okay, I want to talk about the changing meanings of milk. Start with in ancient time. In ancient time, okay, milk is regarded as a kind of medicine in ancient China. I'm not going to go in depth into this area, but I will refer to one particular item about milk used as a kind of medicine because I also do research on this product. That is niuru. Okay, it's a kind of milk cake, or in Asian term, is called the rufu. So this is a kind of a milk that is made by using the vinegar mixed together. I'm going to go in depth into that later. So this is because the milk, especially water buffalo milk, is regarded as cooling according to the traditional Chinese medical principle. So it is being used for cooling down the body, especially for the hot body. So even nowadays in Sunda, this kind of Chinese cheese is being produced and being used for killing the sore throat. So I did research in Sunda around 9 years before. And one of my important informants is she's Miss Leung. She's come from Jimpong village, sort of the original, more is a sort of the traditional place for making the Chinese cheese, the niuru. And she's being invited by the temple managers as a kind of performance of the cultural heritage. And she did the niuru, in that temple. And how she do it is, first of all, she warm up the milk, the water buffalo milk to 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. And then she'll mix with the warm vinegar mix it together in a small porcelain cup, use her index fingers and the middle fingers, turning into a clockwise direction, and then pour the little solutions into a wooden mold, and then press, twist out the water, and then throw the little piece into a kind of big pool of salty water. So this is the way of doing the Chinese cheese. So still nowadays, people will use the thin, a kind of very thin layer of the cheese, accompany the plain congee, or mix it with running water, running hot water as a, I think it's not really very hot, room temperature water as a kind of drink that can kill the hot sore throat. So this is, I just want to highlight this point is that milk is used to be used functionally as a kind of medicine in ancient time. It's not like a daily food. However, stepping into the turn of the 20th century, we have the sort of have the globalization of the Western milk, especially the diffusions of the nutrition science. And this, I put it like there's an increasing strong sentiment that the mother needs to take up a particular role, in Chinese society, that I'm going to come to that. Before I actually talk about what happened in China, I want to introduce a very important person. It's Dr. Almond McCullen. He is being nicknamed as the Dr. Vitamin because he's the one inventor of vitamin A, B, and D. And he also, although some people complain that he's being dishonest because some of other scientists also discovered the vitamin, but he didn't give credit to that scientist. But still, he's now, up till now, the most renowned person talking about nutrition, discovery of vitamin. He wrote a book in 1918 about the neural knowledge of nutrition, and he has a very strong tie with the dairy company. He has been working for the milk powder company for decades, and he once pointed out that milk is the most protective food. He also mentioned he believed that people in civilized Western society drink milk, so that's why they are more intelligent and also have a stronger body. And this kind of idea is very much well received in China because this is the progressive and young, educated young people. They're looking for a way to strengthen China, especially under the condition that this is continuous defeat of China in various wars at that time during the turn of the century in the 20th century. And we see that, that is very clearly reflected by some of the new milk company at that time. For example, white milk. So they turned the brand name as the Vitamin Plus Milk. So it's called white milk that was established in the 1930s. And also white soil, okay, even though it is a soy milk in 1940, it is established in Hong Kong, but because of the influence, the new idea that, okay, the whole nutrition science that proved that soy milk is good for health, because Chinese people used to think that soy milk is too cooling for the especially elderly people. It's not good for health. But once it was being proved that this is with good vitamin, okay, with good nutrition, it gives the people a new perspective in looking at the same food. So, and also looking at the body, because the body no longer, okay, eat a food based on hot and cold, but based on Western science nutrition. So this is one example showing the important influence of the Western science to the Chinese society, starting thinking about the body, and also what is the meaning of health. And however, the Western science, nutrition science is not directly diffused to China, but via Japan, especially through the home economies. So this during the 90s, I think it's 90s, it is a growth of the Western idea about home economies at that time in Europe and also in USA. And however, okay, this kind of new discipline of study is first of all, okay, is well received in Japan. And many of the educators in Japan wrote book about that. And it is being localized in sort of the Asian term. And the Chinese and the Japanese text is being translated into China. So the Chinese early teaching about home economy, including the scientific method of raising kids, are based on the Japanese version. And from that onward, okay, together with the influence of the May 4th movement during the 1990s, advocating the importance of Mr. Science. So, and also Mr. Democracy at that time. So this is a sign of very new and progressive thinking that, okay, we need to educate the woman because the woman need to know how to raise strong kids. So you see this kind of thinking is also well received by the advertiser for the milk company. So you can see that, okay, they having the, on one hand, they advocate that this is a kind of modern milk, okay, they use the English name and highlight that it is made in USA, okay, and also they highlight the headline is that in order to have a strong country, you have to have the strong people. In order to have the strong people, you have to have the strong baby. And this is exactly what's advocated by the sort of influential elite group at that time, that they want to educate the woman, give the national educated woman on home economy. It's very much focused on being a good mother to raise strong kids and build strong nation at that time. And at the same time, advertiser of the milk company aggressively promote milk powder and also condensed milk in China and also Southeast Asia because there are surplus supplies of milk powder and also condensed milk because that is this is mainly used as a military food at that time. And even before the war ends, there's already surplus supply. And after the war, okay, that even there's no demand, almost no demand, I would say, in local country because they do not drink, most people do not drink powdered milk, and they use the condensed milk mainly for bakery. And so they aggressively promote condensed milk as a kind of nutritious infant food. And in addition to the industrialized milk, there's also the foreign dairy farm starting from 1949, after the establishment of Communist Party, they also convert the foreign dairy farms to the military farm, giving people the idea that this is the dairy products are very nutritious. That's why it is the privilege given to the military force. So from that onward, the association between strong body and also Western milk is start to establish strongly among the Chinese people. So in addition to having, linking the Western milk science, nutrition science with, okay, building strong nation, the milk company also market the milk as a way to attack backwardness and traditionalness, especially on the Westerners. As you can see in this ad, so you can see that the condensed milk is being with the woman, okay, this is as if she is, the condensed milk can be replacing the role of a wet nurse to be a substitute of the mother's milk, but that wet nurse is scientific, and without any illness. Okay, so it is sort of building a kind of otherness or backwardness, okay, on wet nursing. And in addition to these two levels, another major point the marketing of the formula milk at that time is that they highlight the competition between the husband and the baby. So this is always a strong, long time tension that the woman's body is for both the desire of the husband and also on the baby. As you can see in this short, okay, footnote is talking about the husband wants the body of the wife, but the wife, okay, when the baby cries, she pushed away the husband. So there's a kind of tension between the husband and the baby, and the milk company catch these sensations and build up new branding, not only rely on the nutrition science, but also on the desire of the woman want to keep a good body shape to satisfy the desire of the man, or maybe herself want to keep a good body shape as well for her own, okay, purpose. So this is some of the brand that highlight the beautiful woman, using the beautiful woman as a brand name. That is a kind of modernity. So this is like another cover, okay, that is about a comic. That is a modern woman with very good body shape, very fashionable. And there is a tagline is that the beautiful woman, okay, for that my milk is not for the baby. Okay, should declare that this is a kind of expression of individualism and also a kind of modern identity. And you can see the baby on the bottom of the right corner that she's putting, the baby is accompanied by the a kind of bottle feeding, okay, the bottle for infant feeding. And in addition to the woman's body, I also want to highlight how the milk, Western milk, also shape idea of the healthy baby. So the milk company also launched a number of marketing activities in order to attract, okay, the consumptions of Western milk. One way is to hold healthy baby competitions. So the judge will base on the chumpy face, the happy face and of the baby, and also they will have a kind of a competition of how fast the baby can move. So this, you can see that at that time, okay, that being a strong baby, okay, that we rely them to build a strong nation is very much on the physical appearance of the baby. However, this kind of scenario gradually changed. So I will highlight that it is the role of the moral role of the mother changed from building a strong sort of baby body to become not only an educated mother, but a wise mother that can lead to build a very smart baby in order to compete in the new market and win in the new world, global games, and build the new nations. So this is what happened, okay, in more recent society, I would say. Still, okay, Western science play a very important role. One of the indicator is the development of food pyramids in the 1980s in USA. According to Marianne Nestle, she pointed out very clearly about the politics of food. This particular category of the milk with the dairy product is a kind of result of the power negotiations between the milk company and also the government and also the nutrition association. So that's why they particularly highlight that everyone needs to drink 2 to 3 servings per day. And then, however, this model is being borrowed and modified by other countries, such as in China, developed the food pagoda in 2000s. And we find still there is a particular category of milk. Introducing the volume of milk is almost 3 times the average consumption of the Chinese people. Although you can see that there's also soy milk and also beans in the same category. But if you read the guidebook, okay, you find inside the text, they emphasize a lot about the milk, but not the soy milk. And the nutrition is regarding the milk is much more than the soy milk in the guidebook. So if you look deeper in the guidebook, in fact, the government is advocating the consumption of milk instead of the soy milk. And I will highlight that this is a kind of scenario is that the woman now still bear an important moral role in giving the building her own body in order to build a strong child. But the strong child, in a way, is no longer on the physical body, but on the brain development. That's mean the intellectual body as well, in order to fight not the military war, but the knowledge war. So the Western cow meals now is transformed in a way that can especially build a strong brain. One of the super nutritions that is being highlighted in Asian society, but not that really in Western society. When I compare the ad content in Western society and the Asian society, one of the biggest difference is the highlight of the DHA. So although it is also highlighted in Western society, but not in a way that's what I'm going to talk about here. So you can take a look. First of all, the woman, okay, is being always keep on convincing that she is need to take the mother's milk, which is rich in DHA. So it seemed to be she's lack of that. But in fact, the breast and the breast milk is already have more than sufficient DHA for the babies. So there's in fact no need to drink extra milk for that. But this is how all the milk companies are advocating, and including some of the medical doctors as well. So you see, okay, DHA, like the classroom, okay, they need to teach the mothers that they need to, like a classroom, you need to attend classes to learn how to drink formula milk in order to have more DHA. DHA is the amino acid, okay, omega-3 amino acid that is essential for the building of the brain and also the retina, good for the eye. That's true. But in fact, one thing they didn't highlight is that the breast milk has sufficient or more than sufficient of DHA. But it gives people the perception is that they should need to intake the mother's milk in order to get sufficient DHA. And about the image of the brain appear in all the ads, okay, from the mother's milk to the children's milk, you can see that, okay, all the brain happened, okay, but you will not see this kind of highlight of the brain in Western society at the formula. And the function of the brain is not only about intellectual ability, but you can see that there's 4 areas, including mobility, emotions, and also language. Why they highlight this 4 areas? I'm going to talk about this is all essential for academic excellence. And even you see this is the icon putting in the packaging of Mead Johnson's formula milk, they always put A+, indicating that they want to sell a dream for the mother that the children will got A+ results. So it is pretty obvious. So so you will see that, okay, they highlight this is 5 times DHA in Mead Johnson, they highlight this is 8 times DHA. It seems to be the more DHA, the higher the mark the children can get. And not only the academic marks, you see that they also have also other talent like music instrument, because in order to get into elite school in Asian society, no matter in Japan, China, and Hong Kong, you have to have academic excellence, plus together you have to have 1 or 2 musical instruments in order to get into that kind of elite school. So how about the voices of the mother? So I interviewed people, talk about that. And one of the she's well educated, she's a banker herself, and she read a lot of magazine, like Time magazine. She learned about the function of DHA is good for the brain, especially during the pregnant period. And so she drank the milk, although she hated the taste is not good. Together, she also followed the Chinese tradition of eating other pooping, like the edible bird's nest for usually it is reserved for the rich people, rich family before they give birth. And no matter in the ad in China or Hong Kong, you can see that the milk is formula milk is always related to academic excellence. They will tell you what time to drink the milk, like wake up in the morning after the exercise, including preparing for examinations. That's the important, okay? And then, okay, their learning ability is directly related to milk. Another voice from the mother, okay, like because formula milk do not only sell milk, they sell other other side products. For example, one mother, she's very delighted to share her experience with me is that the formula milk company not only provide milk, but a kind of apps that she can use to train up her 3-year girl, okay, to prepare for the interview because she find out that 3-year-old son, because her son is quite shy, okay, in front of the others. And the apps will help you, help the mothers to record the, like training some of the interview questions, and then she can record the performance of the son and then rehearse again and again. So you can see, okay, this is nothing related to milk, right? But it directly point to the ultimate goal that they are selling a dream to the mother that they can win, okay, academic excellence. They can enter into elite school by performing well in the interviews. So you see their ad is not about purely nutrition. You can see the brain here, but she's not only at the brain. The ultimate goal, the need of the mother is to have the baby, okay, the young kids to enter into good kindergarten and then a good primary school, and then project that she will have a good life. However, it creates burden, okay, for those mothers who want to breastfeed. Okay, some of the mothers know that, okay, breastfeed is the best. And however, and another dynamic is that the workload in Hong Kong, okay, and also in China is very heavy. And they, on one hand, even maternity leave, they need to work like this one in the insurance to work in the insurance agents to sell insurance product. So the client will call her up even in the maternity leave. And she's so stressful that she finds she doesn't have sufficient milk for the baby. So on one hand, she's bombarded by all the message that the formula milk has such a high nutrition. On the other hand, she wants to breastfeed, but she doubts about her own body. So the whole exercise about the marketing will subconsciously or consciously let the woman think about, okay, doubt about the ability of her own body. And she changed her idea about the meaning of health and also the function of her body. And now, okay, I want to focus on the gender grammar of minority. Okay, so how this kind of scenario make us reflect on what is a woman role? Okay, what is being a moral mother or being a good mother and wife and also a worker? So first of all, we can tell from all these ads is we find from even from during the turn of the century, 20th century, that we start to have the Western science, nutrition science, with the medical doctor having a kind of moral authority, okay, that the more advanced, progressive young people, okay, need to look upon as a kind of guidance. So what is meaning of the right way of raising kids and right way of looking at your own body and right way to judge what is the meaning of healthiness. So it's kind of like our Bach talk about rich society that we rely on the expertise on that. Next will be, okay, we need to start that women need to identify the source of the life problem, including the life problem of their babies and also child. And the remedies is keep on reflecting the self-examinations of their own health belief and dietary behavior, of course, including breastfeeding, formula feeding, and also her own diet, especially when she is pregnant. And a kind of disciplining the body, okay, that is in this case is about dietary control, consumption of formula milk. So this is the kind of the formula milk company will further bring it forward that this by controlling what you input into your body and your baby's body, is a way to achieve self-actualization, as we can see in this ad. So this is a kind of better me. So drinking the mother's milk, okay, you can transform your body to become not only for your baby, but you utilize this kind of opportunity of giving birth also to test your potential, your new potential, to not only for yourself, but also for the baby. And that is a kind of transformation of yourself, this kind of exploring your own potential. And and also this kind of moral grammar is being integrated into the daily language. And this become a kind of self-help, especially important in neoliberal society, that when Hong Kong government, Chinese government are cutting on the budgets, on social welfare, on privatizing their education system, etc. So women need to rely on themselves by controlling the body, by controlling what they consume in order to bear a moral responsibility. So, come to the last part on concluding remarks. That's back to my two core questions on what is the changing of milk and how that affect our understanding of my body, my baby's body, and also myself, my subjectivity and the meaning of morality. So in ancient time, Chinese use milk mainly as a kind of medical food. So they consume different mammals' milk, not only cow's milk, for different purpose. And mainly on the physical body, it's not for the brain at all. But milk changed dramatically on the meaning, and that's why the cells suit up, right? Because they can solve so many problems. So the first problem, the Western milk are being used to solve is national project of strengthening the military body of the nations. So already women are put into upfront that they bear the moral responsibility in building the national body. And women education start with being a good mother and nutrition science. And then we enter, into the next era that changed from military war to the knowledge war. Women also put, upfront to bear the responsibility to bring up a smart baby, to compete in a knowledge war. And at the same time, she herself also facing global competitions in employment. And very much big pharmaceutical company are using milk, promoting milk as a solution to economic social problem in the rich society. And the primacy has changed from body to the brain. And the mothers, is being convinced that this kind of moral responsibility is a way to self-actualize. She is a way to bearing the burdens. In effect, is a way to express her own, to fulfill her own potentials. So, but in fact, there is just bearing a very heavy moral obligations and have a triple burdens. Being a good mother, good wife, and also being a good self in modern society. So that's pretty the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for a fabulous talk. Could I ask you to stop sharing your screen, please, for the discussion? I think that would make it easier, so we can probably see everybody that way. I'm going to abuse chair's privilege and ask the first question whilst others are gathering their thoughts. And please do keep your hands raised. There's so many questions. It was a fabulous paper. Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask one question, though, of the many that I have, which is this. You began with a very kind of regional perspective, a micro-regional perspective, looking at particular traditions of dairy, making consumption and shundak, but then you kind of, your paper expanded this and immediately into a kind of at a kind of national level, a national scale. I wonder whether there are ways in which even these kinds of discourses around modernity, around nation, around health, mental health, and bodily health, or physical health, and mental health, and also women's moral responsibilities that you're talking about, whether there are any kinds of regional dimensions to that as well. In other words, is there anything particular about the Hong Kong dimension of what you're talking about that might not be identical to other parts of China, for example?
Okay, thank you for very good questions. I think it is a very valid questions. I think first of all, I would like to, I also have this question in mind when I do the study of milk. And first of all, I look into both the micro and macro parts. I did research in Sunda, and definitely this data come from Sunda and Hong Kong. However, for the advertisement, it is nationalized. Okay, it is not limited to in Sunda. And I also read other study, okay, by other scholar. They share very similar concern that the woman have double. There's, in fact, the gap is not between the geographically. The gap is between generation. So the grandma generations have different thinking about the with the younger generations. So there's paper about how the mother's mother, okay, think about the nutritions, think about health and body versus the younger generation. So what I get is still the young generation emphasize a lot of vitamins and the modern science. So and in Hong Kong as well. What I find, okay, when I do the cross comparison between mainland China and Hong Kong is that Hong Kong people tend to have the trend is move towards breastfeeding more than China. Okay, China is some more like Shanghai, Beijing, the more educated women, they also start to move to breastfeeding, but still very niche. But they start to have sorts of this kind of movement. But and also scholar point out that they are having a double burden as well, similar to what I mentioned today. So I think, yeah, so that's why what I see in Hong Kong at more recently, one of the biggest difference is that now formula milk are now promoting the milk in a way to help the woman breastfeed. But this kind of ad doesn't happen in China yet. So I don't know whether I can answer this question. They do have some regional difference, but I think it's mainly on the generation difference. It's more than the regional difference.
Great, thank you so much. Now, there were lots of hands up, but these have now disappeared. You can please do raise your hands again, so I can see who you are who wants to ask a question. I know that Miranda had her hand up, for example, earlier. Do you want to go ahead, Miranda, whilst others think about their questions?
I'm sorry, I can go ahead. Can you hear me? I'm trying to prevent my iPad from being drained of power. This is another annoyance this morning of technology. I was actually going to ask you, I know you talk about this in the books, so I'm advertising this, but could you talk a bit about sort of maybe the connections? Like, it's often we think of sort of the transition from modern to pre-modern as a rupture. But, one thing that I thought was really interesting about your book was the way that pregnant women, women who are priming their womb were actually taking these sort of milky concoctions to enhance their physical fitness, for the all important job of producing, a prime prime baby, or high quality baby. So I don't know if you want to talk about that. To me, it's just such a interesting, sort of potential sort of legacy of this sort of, I don't know what we say, tonic uses of medicine, which were, quite pervasive, especially in the 19th century.
You mean in the earlier time, that is before how the formula milk can help the pregnant woman? You mean during the 1930s, 40s?
Or just right now, the sort of current, there's they have the formulas for the mommies now, or the pre-mommy, the pre-pregnant, woman formulas. I mean, it just seems to be somehow connected to the pre-modern practice. I don't know if you want to speculate on that, those kind of connections.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I think you mean what the mothers you mean they do in modern society. I think they will have both the traditional way of helping the like they drink sort of the pool, the sort of the warm and hot food in order to have the extra nutrition for the baby on one hand. So I use the example like the eatable bird's nest. And some they also have different, they have some details on different periods divided, okay, before they give birth. Some, okay, right before the giving birth, they need to have eat some more, a little bit more cooling food. So they still combine the traditional Chinese method, but on the other hand, they also being advised by the Western doctors. They if they think that they are too thin, they will have probably, okay, most probably they will drink the formula milk. That they think that they can absorb the DHA and also all kind of sufficient nutrition. But one important thing is that formula milk also emphasize that they have very low fat. So this is one way that the mothers also have a sort of moral obligation to keep extra slim body, even though they are being pregnant. So this kind of dynamic is very difficult to achieve if you follow the traditional Chinese formula of eating, because you probably will get fat. So formula milk company, they are very smart. They will say that you get sufficient nutrition, but you can have your body being slim. Okay, so that's another attractiveness of formula milk for the mother to be prepared to be a good mother to give birth. So I don't know whether I can answer your questions.
And that's really, can you talk about the formula itself that the women take? That seems, I mean.
So I was wondering, maybe we have a couple of hands up and we don't have that much time left. So if that's all right, maybe we can get back to these later on, if that's okay. So we have a question from Tongao and a question from Joshua Fitzgerald. Maybe if each of you could ask your question, we'll take both questions and then maybe Veronica can answer both of them.
Oh, thank you very much, Veronica and Jack, for organizing this event and for Veronica's interesting presentation about the story of milk in China. This is Gaosheng from Hong Kong University, Department of Sociology. Okay, actually, I do not work on milk. Okay, I work on Guangzhou's old-time brand business, Guangzhou Gelou Jiahou. But one of the Guangzhou's well-known old-time brand business is Shunji ice cream shop. It was established in 1930s. Okay, before the communist revolution, communist success of the taking over the country. Okay, but the problem that when I read the whole story of the Shunji ice cream store, ice cream shop, I find that okay, after the mid 1950s, the shop had been transformed into a state-owned enterprise, and so the business has been had been disrupted, and the dairy products had been disappeared from the menu of the shop. And also this situation happened in other places. For me, I come from North China, from Anhui province. But in my own memory, okay, we do not hear of the term milk before 1980s because of the problems of food shortage and poverty, or grape farming and so on. So I think that if we talk about the whole story of milk, we may consider the discontinuity of the milk supply and the milk consumption in the modern history of contemporary China. Okay. Also, I follow Jakob's question about the regional dimension. Okay. I also find in mainland China, if you talk about milk, you have to pay attention to the ethnic differentiation, okay, such as the Han Chinese, the Mongolian ethnic culture, or a lot of other, okay, ethnic cultures, ethnic people, they rely on milk for their daily food. Okay, so whether or not milk is not food in Chinese history, it depends on the history you talk about, the specific ethnic group. Okay, that's all for my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Joshua, do you want to ask your question as well, please?
Is it all right? Do we have time for that? Is that okay? I just
We'll
don't
take
want
both questions, and then Veronica will say as much as she wants to.
Yeah. I just, my question is a sort of related question. It's about agency of the consumer, purchaser, consumer. These, how you might track also, and I'm sorry I haven't read the book yet, but how you might track some of the informal aspects of mothers making choices. I'm thinking of a colleague's work, Hilary Max and Kobayashi's work, a dissertation on account books in Japan in the same sort of period, and how you can see mothers making choices that are affecting the market, from their choices, their purchases. And if you see some connection between these two sort of different texts, these documents that you might be looking at.
You have 4 minutes for your answer, Veronica.
You mean, okay, so may I reframe your questions again? Is that you mean on the cross-country comparisons about Japan and also how that happened in China? Do you mean that? That I can come up with some of the interesting comparison?
For my question is mainly about the consumer, how women are tracking their purchases of formula, or whether they are tracking, if they go in and purchase, if you can see this aspect of a mother's moral sort of choices on the ground level in a household. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So you mean the mother, how to make the decisions on the choosing of different brand, and also making decisions whether she breastfeed or she take the formula milk, right? So when I did the field work, I think the mothers, when you choose the brand, is quite related to also the social class on the what they can afford. And also however, some of the working class, they also emphasize that even they are willing to use half of the salary to buy the import milk because of the food safety problem in China. So because especially when I did the fieldwork, it's quite like 8 years before. At that time, it's especially after the crisis about the melamine. So the people are willing, because there's the only child. So, and also another important thing is quite like the like Professor Yang talked about McDonald's, is that they think drinking the formula milk is a way to get access to Western culture. So I did really have this. Some of the informants told me that they want the kids to connect to be more cosmopolitan place and drinking more safe milk. So they are willing to pay a very high percentage of the salary to buy the import formula milk. So this is the why the foreign milk is such a big market in China. So can I answer your question?
Are you are you satisfied?
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay. So Veronica, unless you have more things to say to either of those questions, maybe we should move on to our second speaker. And thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and a very interesting discussion. So thank you so much. So we're now on to our second speaker, Professor Miranda Brown. And Miranda is a professor of Chinese studies and Arthur F. Thurman professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Michigan, where she is currently snowed in. Her research focuses on the history of foodways and medicine in China. And among other things, she's working on a book on dairy in early modern Jiangnan, so the Yangzi area, Shanghai region, broadly speaking. And she has a wonderful article about this that came out in Gastronomica in 2019, and we look forward to learning more about this current project. So Miranda.
Long enough. So I will just sort of walk through my slides. So today I'm going to be talking about A Taste from the North, and this is going to be a talk that's focused on the early modern, and I'm going to weave in a little gender here and there. So my apologies for sort of missing the prompt. So maybe we could go to the next slide, please, Nikki. Okay, so whoops, I think there's one before that. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with a recipe by a fellow named Shue, and this is a recipe actually to make string cheese, and according to Shue, who lived in 1504 in an area close to Shanghai called Songjiang, this was his mom's formula or recipe. So he has two recipes. One is for fresh cheese that's called ruobing, that's made with vinegar or some kind of sours, and then another cheese which is made like mozzarella, where you immerse the cheese in the freshly made cheese in the hot water, and then it starts to miraculously stretch, and you knead it, and then you put it on poles to stretch. Next slide, please. Now, when I first came across this recipe, I was actually rather surprised. And why was I surprised? Because largely, I had been under the impression that, dairy products were not widely consumed in China or consumed at all until the 20th century, when, Westerners brought in cow's milk. And this view, I think, is, quite sort of commonplace. You see it, throughout sort of advertising, any kind of website about Asian food. And it was also certainly something that my mom told me, sort of growing up, in San Francisco. My mom was actually from the Pearl River Delta. And so, just to sort of insult somebody this morning, I'll just go after Mark Kurlansky because he makes a lot more money than all of us here. But, he writes in his famous sort of global history of milk that throughout history, the Han, as the ethnic Chinese call themselves, as opposed to the Mongols, Tibetans, and other ethnic groups living in the area, have rarely eaten dairy food. Okay, so next slide, please. So I won't belabor the sort of common view, but I just want to just offer some pictures of the recipes that we just saw on the earlier slide. Here, of course, are some fresh made cheeses. This is made with goat's milk or cow's milk from Yunnan, which of course is Jakob's area of research, just to give you sort of a concrete image. Next slide, please. And then this is the second cheese, the string cheese, which has been deep fried after it's been stretched. It's also called milk fans, or in ancient times it was called milk threads. And it's something to do with the dialects where the sounds for thread and fans actually are easily conflated. This is an ethnic Muslim woman, of course, on the street selling a cheese that is now considered largely a minority food in Southwest China. More on that later. Next slide, please. And then this is my effort to make the cheese myself one night after I got my hands on raw milk, which is legal to buy only in 2 states in the United States, land of the free here. But I just wanted to show that you can actually stretch it and that the recipe actually works. Sorry for the haircut. My husband had done it when our kid was small. And then next slide. And then some efforts to sort of reproduce some of the many dairy recipes in this Shanghainese text from 1504. This is a mustard greens that is basically sort of steamed with thick chunks of cheese. Unfortunately, my daughter kept eating them before I could get the plate under control, so the cheese was reduced by a chunk, but that's another matter. And then the next slide. Okay, so why do we care about sort of dairy consumption in China, right? This is a very early morning to talk about something that we think of as not a Chinese food or not a very common Chinese food. Well, if you're sort of going to take the sort of American line that everything matters, if it's in the present, dairy consumption is way up in China. It has gone up, I think, by a factor of, I've now forgot, 25. Is 25 times people, the average per capita consumption rate is 25 times what it was in 1980, and it's sort of projected to triple in the next I guess at this point, next 20 years or 30 years, I'm sorry, by 2050. China is also currently, as of 2022, the world's largest dairy market. And this has, a wide range of sort of supply chain and environmental ramifications that have concerned ecologists as well as sort of consumers. And I'll just stop there. So let me just move on to the next slide. Oh boy. Okay, so I'm going to just sort of mention today that, you know, dairy has a surprisingly long history in China. I can't get into the details, but actually about a week ago, there was a major sort of archaeological find. Archaeologists working in central Shanxi in North China, inside of what we think of as China proper, were able to perform lipid analysis on the remains of ceramic vessels from the 8th century BC. And they discovered, much to their surprise, you know, sort of evidence of widespread dairy consumption inside of China Central in ancient times. And if we kind of step back from the archaeology, there are a lot of sort of textual references, especially in medieval China, that people were consuming dairy in various forms and to various extent, depending on sort of the region. Now, this is something that has surprised me to a great, you know, sort of extent, but it's also largely raised questions for me. So if one question is, of course, is why did dairy sort of quote unquote fail to become a staple of the diet until recently, especially if we now have evidence that in the 8th century BC, people were doing this as on a regular basis, at least in North China. And then what kind of story can we tell, right? Obviously, once you get over the fact that there is dairy in China, which, you know, I spent a couple of years just kind of salivating over, you do have to kind of come up with something a little bit more interesting or more sustained in terms of argumentation. And then sort of a related question is, you know, what can a story about dairy in pre-modern, or in particular early modern China, tell us about the current quest for milk in China? Is there, for example, a connection between the modern and pre-modern sort of modes of consumption? Or is it completely sort of a new thing and a sort of an example of rupture? And so these are the sort of general stakes, and I'll kind of go through what I think are at least part of this. Next slide, please. Oops, there we go. Okay, so now I'm going to just sort of do something counterintuitive. So obviously, as Professor Gao mentioned, there are obvious places to look. If you're interested in dairy in China, you can obviously go to North China, to the steppe, to Inner Mongolia, to the Northwest, which are sort of ethnic Turkic areas today, and sort of evaluate or investigate their sort of use of dairy, right? So I have here some Mongolian milk tea. Mongols, of course, are the world's, you know, sort of biggest milk drinkers. I think only maybe rivaled by people in the Netherlands. And then the next slide, please. But what I'm going to do today instead is go to an area that we generally think of as sort of anti-dairy or sort of dairy-free, and that is the Jiangnan or Lower Yangzi Valley, Delta, sorry. And here, you know, I'm going to be talking about the sort of area sort of broadly known as sort of the Shanghai area, if you're sort of thinking in layman terms. These are actually technically the 9 counties that surround Lake Taihu, which is this big body of water that produces a lot of very nice aquaculture. So this is coastal central China. In historical terms, it's also thought of as the dominant south. The south, of course, being defined by this giant river, the Yangtze. And this is also not, you know, coincidentally, you know, the richest, some would say the most cultured area of China historically. And today it's also the richest area as well. Next slide, please. And then just in case you haven't done the day trip to Shanghai or Jiangnan area, here's a picture of it just to sort of make you want to get on an airplane and, you know, endure 3 weeks of I guess, what would you say, quarantine housing. So a very wealthy area known for its wonderful sort of lifestyle. Next slide, please. Okay, so why am I studying the Jiangnan area? Well, in many ways, this is a counterintuitive choice because we don't think of this sort of wet rice paddy sort of agricultural zone as a place for sheep or cattle. And I'll show you why that makes sense in a second. And then the next sort of bullet, please. However, I will just say that one of the reasons to study this, especially in the early modern period, is that the Jiangnan region has a continuous documentary record of dairy in the region. And it also has sort of a generally good sort of documentary record for foodways. In fact, I would say that in pre-modern times, the sort of Jiangnan region dominates our sort of our account of what Chinese food looks. Okay, so the next slide, please. This is also not coincidentally the place that is the center of dairy consumption in
in early modern times. So this is a quote from 1691, but it's actually a paraphrase from Matteo Ricci. In no place in all China is more butter and milk used than in the city of Suzhou in the province of Nanjing. So very interesting quote. This is also, people who visited Beijing. So the comparison is quite interesting. And then the next bullet, please. This is also not coincidentally one of the most important nexuses of dairy consumption in the early 20th century. I believe that 3 cities, Hangzhou, Nanjing, and Shanghai, basically accounted for half of all dairy production in the first half of the 20th century before the war. So then and now, really an important place for understanding dairy culture. There's going to be a class bias, but here we have it. So next slide. Okay, so what I want to do here is just sort of talk about how to think about, milk in early modern times. I mean, obviously, a lot of the scholarship has been sort of focused on figuring out why milk did not become a daily sort of staple like it did in places like the Netherlands. I find that kind of approach a little bit restrictive, and I think also misses a lot. I think milk is more than just a daily food in this region. It is what I would think of as a cultural artifact. It's implicated in traditions of connoisseurship and foodieism. It's a sort of common discussion point in poetry or in the poetic tradition. It is implicated in debates about court expenditure, especially during the early Ming dynasty, where dairy comes in and out of the sort of imperial diet. It's a sort of an object of fascination in medical treatises. And here I'm going to just kind of do a call out to Veronica's talk. And then it's also something that comes very interestingly in pornographic representations. Milk is actually very, very well represented in the diets of the sort of main protagonist of Jinping Mei, which is this famous novel about manners. And so it's, very sort of closely connected to sort of traditions of consumption and also sensuality. So next slide, please. So I would also just like today focus on this sort of issue of food as an expression of cultural memory, right? So not just my mom's food, but also food ways of sort of an ancestral past that has been sort of in some ways cut off because of politics and borders. And I'll just talk about one idea, which is that milk represents a taste of the North in a period where the Chinese capital and sort of empire has moved into the South because of barbarian invasions. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the case of this famous patriotic poet, Mileo, who's well known for writing very, very gory poetry about his hatred of Northern invaders. But his sort of experiences tracks very well to the beginnings of dairy culture in the Jiangnan region in the 12th and 13th centuries. So next slide, please. So just to give you a picture, here's a picture of Mileo as he's imagined. He's a poet, great alcoholic, rather aggressive drunk, from judging from his gory poetry. And I'll be talking about this dish of goat yogurt and cherries in just a second. So next slide, please. So just in case you haven't made the tour of his house, which sits in the city of Shaoxing, about a 2-hour drive from Shanghai, his poetry is memorized by every school child in China because it's patriotic. It's about defending China's borders against barbarian invasions. Here's a rendering of one of his gorier poems by Mao Zedong in his red sort of calligraphy. Sorry for the sheer, but I think, it gives you a sense of just sort of his connections to modern nationalism. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me just offer a little context, and I think these come with little bullets. I'm sorry for the awkwardness. Mileo, his life kind of in some ways mapped nicely with the Southern Song dynasty. He was born on the River Huai, which would become the border between Song Han Chinese controlled China and then the Jurchen invaders sort of hold on the north. And he was born in 1125, which is right before the sacking of the city. His ancestors were actually, sort of for generations in the south, but his father was actually a loyal official during the Northern Song dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1127. They were members of the sort of hawkish wing that wanted to hold on to the north. But when Liu was 2 years old, the Jurchens invaded the Song Empire and sacked the capital. And so his family left and moved south back to their ancestral home with millions of other Chinese. This also coincides with the time where China is forced to kind of negotiate a humiliating treaty with the Jurchen invaders called the Treaty of Shaoxing. And if you read any sort of standard history book, you hear about all these bad things that happened to China, mostly because of all the pacifists at court. And that's a different talk. But next slide, please. I just want to show you a picture. So here's the Northern Song before 1127. Sort of very much a sort of a, not the largest Chinese empire, but North China is, I think, minus Beijing, firmly in what we think of as sort of Han Chinese hands. Next slide. And then this is sort of China after 1127 or a little bit afterwards. So the capital, the temporary capital is in Hangzhou, which is on the sort of Yangzi Delta. It's a great place. You have a beautiful picture of the West Lake here. In terms of places to sort of live and take refuge, it's not a bad place. But as we'll see momentarily, people here in this paradise are actually always hankering for the north and its foods. So next slide, please. Oh, one more, please, sorry. So here's a picture of Luyo's house. Again, a very southern subtropical region, and I'll get into that in a second. Next slide, please. And then I'll just talk about Luyo. So he writes lots of about food, mostly in poems. He leaves behind 10,000 poems, which are often about his daily meals and also his binge drinking. And the next slide, and then in these poems, dairy products come up quite a bit, so we have a sense of what those sort of meanings are. He talks a lot about one food, yogurt, goat yogurt or sheep yogurt, and I'll get into that. But he also, references other dairy products like butter or cream, and then cow's milk. So let me see. So let me just give you a few poems, and I have to work on my poetry translation, so I apologize that these don't live up to the elegance of the man's sort of writing. But here's one where he's talking about a daily meal in his house in Hangzhou, in the subtropical, sweltering, humid south. It says, the glasses and dishes have been carelessly arranged, but don't laugh at my poverty. The vermilion cherries and the goat yogurt nevertheless taste fresh, meaning they're in season. Then he has a second poem called Eating Yogurt. So he says, Southern cookery and Northern cuisine each mistake itself for the best. I can't help but laugh at the youngsters my children's age. Perch mixed with water bamboo shoots do not really beat goat milk yogurt presented in cherry. Okay, so he's not alone in loving his yogurt. So if you just go to the next slide, here's the kind of competitors, the perch from Shaoxing today, or at least in 2018, and then here's the yogurt. So next slide, please. So just to give him another sort of hawkish figure who's a rough contemporary, this is a poem by Shiji, who was a refugee from the north who escaped south and is just, well, very much about retaking the north. And he writes a poem about yogurt. He says, fragrant, the cherries float with goat milk yogurt in a color glazed bowl. Year after year, I've been used to tasting them in season drunk. What is better than the spring breeze, the barbed lip dyed slightly red? Now, if I were into gender analysis, I might do something with the mouth, but I'm not. So anyway, so what I want to do is sort of talk about why the yogurt is so prominently sort of featured in these poems, especially by these hawks. And I want to go back to Luyo's poem. So I think if we get to the next slide, I will sort of, we have here this goat milk yogurt, sort of referenced in relation to Northern cuisine, and then the fish, of course, was Southern cuisine. So next slide, please. So some takeaways. So goat yogurt in this particular poem, but also in the sort of larger sort of time, is really synonymous with the cuisines of China's north, or the north in general. And then the next bullet, please. Perch, of course, and water oats, which is a vegetable, stand in for Jiangnan, the Yangzi Delta in particular, and the South more generally. And then I think the next bullet. And these associations are actually not new to Luyo's time. They actually, I think, sort of hail from a much longer poetic tradition. Next point. And in fact, they're about 1,000 years old by 1126 or 1127. I think there's another bullet, sorry. Okay, so I'll just please, yes. So when these poems talk about North and South, perch and water oats on the one hand and yogurt on the other. They're largely referring to a sort of an anecdote from the early medieval period. It's a famous text called the News Tales of the World. It's attributed to the sort of major literatus of the 5th century, Liu Yiqing. And this is a story that sort of involves a confrontation between a northerner and a southerner. The northerner basically says, you know, when the southerner comes to visit, you know, here's some goat yogurt. What do you guys have that can match this, you southerners? I think there's another bullet. And basically the southerner says, well, we have unflavored sort of waters, sort of like oats, which is a vegetable, in stew form, and when it's even unsalted, it's equal or better than your sort of your favorite sort of goat yogurt. So very strong sense of regional culinary pride, and a little bit of a hint of antagonism as well. And then next slide, please. And then just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. So, you know, yogurt, dried yogurt is a big thing in early medieval China in the north. And then this sort of seaweed stew or even water oat stew is sort of its competitor. So, you know, very different kinds of sort of taste profiles. Next slide, please. And here we have, of course, sort of the next slide, sorry to do this to you. The two sort of ecologies. So the north, of course, in the early medieval period is actually pretty steppy because of a cooling event. So lots of sheep and horses and cattle to some extent. And then the south is, you know, hot, damp, low-lying, full of rice production and aquatic fare, just to give you a sense. Okay, so the next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things I find very interesting is that Liu is clearly eating these sort of so-called northern foods in the South, and it's rather striking that he still associates these foods with the South. And I think of, you know, one way to explain this is that stereotypes about food are quite stubborn, especially in a poetic tradition that is highly self-referential. So I like to think that, you know, you can get clam chowder we associate here with Boston, but you can buy this in Atlanta, in the South. You know, we still talk about the sword when in an age of nuclear arms. And so these associations, I think, work very similarly in the Chinese classical tradition, if not even more so. So goat milk yogurt in the 12th and 13th century remains a northern food for many, many centuries, even though it's very much a part of sort of elite and even daily life in the 12th and 13th century. The next point, please. So what I just want to kind of mention is that Liu's poems indicate that soured goat milk or yogurt is a metaphor for northern identity, even as tastes are changing in the South. Next slide. And one of the sort of historical explanations is that the fall of the capital of the North in 1127 brings an influx of northern immigrants to South China and the Yangzi Delta in particular. They not only bring their food, but they actually bring their language. And so if you go to these former Song capitals, people are still speaking a version of Northern Chinese dialect or capital of the standard sort of language of the Song dynasty. But what's striking to me is the way that dairy figures not only representations of this sort of in the diet, but also of the imagination or the cultural memory of the North. Next slide, please. And one of the things we see actually right after sort of the move is that within 100 years, dairy products are very, very popular in the elite diet. There's uses of butter. Next point, please. You find butter, for example, in various recipes for people are cooking bamboo shoots, clarified butter. They're preparing fritters made with edible flours in butter. They're making cookies with butter, and this is all in the Yangzi Delta, which I find very interesting. Now, what I think is really interesting is that by the 13th century, but by the time that Liu dies as an old man in his 80s, Southerners in the Yangzi Delta are producing plenty of fine butter and actually quite proud of it. Next point, please. And this is really, I think, a product of the migration from the North in the preceding century. Next point, please. And in fact, if you look at local gazetteers, which I think provide a little bit more information than poems, is that you really have actually even butter rivalry in the Yangtze Delta between the major city of Suzhou, which is a sort of mercantile sort of center, and Hangzhou, which is the capital, and also has a lot of cultural pretensions in this period. Next slide. And one of the things we know is that today, even today, there is a breed of sheep that were brought with the migration to the south. It's called Huyang. They sort of the Hu is like three. It's like it's for the lake, so it's Tai Hu the Hu. So these are lake sheep that northerners brought to the sweltering south in the 12th century and have managed to stay alive for the last 8 centuries, despite the heat. And this is actually probably the breed of sort of sheep that were producing the goat milk yogurt that Mileo was talking about. So an enormous effort to sort of in some ways transplant animals and foodways into an alien sort of ecology or environment. Next slide, please. And now here's also a hill called Guangfu, which is outside of Suzhou, which is actually was up until the 18th century, very, very famous for its high quality dairy products. This is an area that's quite rich, so they don't have to produce, staple grains. The hills also are very good for raising cattle and sheep as well. And the local farming communities actually were quite sort of good at feeding the animals so that they could in some ways have dairy products even in the winter when generally animals dry off. So this is an evidence of sort of a very significant and advanced I would say sort of luxury market for dairy products. Next slide, please. So just to give you a passage about this is actually from about 1200 AD. This is a local sort of writer talking about sort of the history of dairy in his area. And he talks about how in the past there was no dairy, and that the best dairy was actually, produced historically in the Central Plains in Henan up north, where people were using soured milk and butter to cook things, and their cream was really considered to be top notch. But the local historian really emphasizes that Southerners, meaning people in the Yangzi Delta, also make these things in his time. And these products are especially fine in the various towns of Kuaiji near Hangzhou, where each town competes with the other to be the best. And then he goes on to argue that the butter, even though it's most plentiful in Wu County, this is in the Shanghai area where Mr. Song is up in the north, is very plentiful. Its flavor in general is really weak and cannot compare to that in his area of Hangzhou and Kuaiji. Next slide, please. And then he goes on to sort of rehearse the story about the sort of confrontation between the northerner and southerner, and kind of amuse it, muses that really that this is an odd story. But he says, well, maybe in those days they didn't have it, or milk had yet to come to the south. Okay, so the next slide, please. So the coming of milk to the south, I think, is quite interesting. It obviously tracks these political developments, the movement of the capital, also the movement of people and the culture of the northern capital into the Yangtze Delta. But what I think is interesting is that Southerners go out of their way. Not only do they raise sheep in the worst possible place in the world to raise sheep, but they also, import the dairies from the capital and transplant them right in the north. And I argue that really that kind of effort, which I think is in some ways strained, bears witness to the efforts of people who are emigres to hold on, to the memories of the north, to the idea of China as a sort of a northern or central plains civilization. And that Mileo, even though he himself is a southerner, is also very focused on holding on to the sort of lost north. So in his poems, we see him holding on in various ways. He makes butter tea in the morning. This is actually not the earliest references to a dairy-based tea, but one of the earlier ones. He also stews milk congees, probably for health, but also it's a popular food in this period with the elite. And he eats plenty of goat yogurt as he's reminiscing about the north that he himself never saw. Maybe he remembers it as a 2-year-old, but I doubt it. It's a sort of imaginary north that he knows not by sight because the border's closed, but largely through foods and tastes. And I would argue actually that this is what milk is doing in sort of South China in this period. It is a way of knowing a sort of lost homeland that through taste and not by sight. And this is one of the ways in which milk is productive and important outside of it as a source of calories. And I'll stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for a fabulous paper, Miranda. I'm going to refrain from asking my questions, and we'll see if there's time for that. Marta, you have a question.
Well, yeah, actually it was applauding, but yeah, I'm going to ask one question. Actually, first of all, thank you so much for these two fascinating papers. Well, I have so many questions, but I'm going to just ask one for both of you. Is the question of milk intolerance? Yeah, because I was thinking about the Marvin Harris work and this categorization between lactophobos and lactophile societies, and yeah, and which is the place of intolerance and in your, I mean, in your particular work.
Miranda, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say this, and of course that come off the cuff. But I don't think milk intolerance is a really well understood. I have a separate project where I'm working with Alice Yao at Chicago on the history of lactose intolerance as a medical concept, and it's a fraught medical concept. Clinicians actually have basically think that the sort of idea of genetics doesn't work. And this has, I think, been, sort of largely sort of substantiated by studies of people who, studies where they actually look at how people digest milk, not milk sugars, in a laboratory. And the evidence is really sort of like all over the map. I mean, there's also theories now that people are not allergic to the milk sugars, but actually it's maybe the sort of milk proteins that are specific to particular breeds of cattle that are now dominant because of the, the global dairy industry. So this is, I think, something that is not a established scientific fact, but something that is, I think, quite unclear and largely, I think, up for grabs. There's another problem too, which is that historically the sort of concept of milk intolerance is formed around this idea of sort of European exceptionalism. That it came up in sort of Veronica's talk, but sort of acquired a sort of a medicalized form in the post-war era. So not surprisingly, white supremacists in the US have kind of adopted milk consumption or the ability to digest milk as sort of a hallmark of true whiteness, which is, and unfortunately, won me and Alice a little bit of attention on certain websites. So I'll stop there. It's a little scattered. I'm still waking up and to shut up.
Veronica?
Yes. So I think I didn't really look into in big details. However, what I can share some experience about my fieldwork and also what I study about the current study about lactose intolerance. First of all, I find that there are different kind of measurement of lactose intolerance. So there may be different findings based on different kind of measurement. So still there is not an absolute rule on which kind of measurement is the best. So sometimes I also got confused on the percentage of lactose intolerance because it really depends on what kind of rules you follow to measure. Okay, what is the period of time? Okay, what is the period, and also how much you intake? So all kind of variables. So it will make a difference. And also what I read is what my research find that those who continue to adopt milk, like most of my informant in China, suppose that Chinese to be lactose intolerant. So however, most of the children I meet, when they start non-stop drinking milk continuously to the teenage, they don't have much problem on drinking milk. So that's one of the finding is that if you keep on from the when you're child to adults, you keep on drinking milk, you sort of the body can digest it in some way. You don't give you a kind of discomfort that you cannot tolerate. So there's also finding that even for those lactose intolerance, you can drink around 1 or 1/2 of cup of milk is fine. So the intolerance still has a range. Yeah, so that's what I understand. I don't know whether it can answer your questions.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Melissa.
Hi, thank you to both of you for excellent talks. And actually, this is a question for both of you about wet nurses. I think, Veronica, you mentioned it very briefly in your first talk, and also about breast milk kind of more generally in China. I know that's a big topic, but it just, if you have any thoughts, it'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so for wet nursing, okay, I will. For me, I'm not. I didn't really study by myself, but I read an excellent book by Dr. Lo Sok-ying. So she did her PhD in Shanghai. She studied particular Shanghai, and also she mentioned about wet nursing. So wet nursing is quite a common practice among, especially on the upper class among the Chinese people. There are two reasons. First of all, in order to you can help the mothers to maximize the production of the baby. Because for there's if the mother concentrate on breastfeeding, though she can may not be necessarily able to carry a baby so quick. So it's quite used for the wealthy family when they want to really build a big family. So it's quite common to use the wet nurse. Another is for the demand of the husband. So this is another reasons for the use of wet nurse. It's quite common among them, but later they, because they still, until what I read about her, the study is that even until 1940s, the people still think that, okay, the mother should breastfeed. Okay, the mother's milk are the best. So their alternative will be the human milk rather than have milk powder. So still there is a sort of two main, sort of conflicts about modern milk and also the wet nursing. So still, that's why the milk company create advertisement to attack the wet nurse. Yeah. Okay. So, so you also mentioned about breastfeeding. That okay? Well, which area you want to talk about breastfeeding?
I mean, we don't have lots of time, so I might just leave that. Thank you for now, Veronica. Thank you. I mean, I can't think of any more gendered work than breastfeeding or wet nursing, so that's why I was asking it.
Miranda,
okay.
did you have?
And yeah, sorry. I also understand when I say China, that's a little bit general.
Okay. Breast milk is interesting. I mean, obviously there's been this medicinal use of breast milk, and that Europeans were fascinated with, especially in the 19th century when the dairy industry is often going in the sort of in the Anglo-American world, and that there's a story that a Victorian sort of missionary says that he's out in the Yangzi Delta, and he says that he never sees any real cow's milk. He thinks he sees milk, and it turns out it's a woman's milk, and so this I think spurs a lot of interesting myths about China as a land of where men drink breast milk. And there I think we could have sort of a conversation about why there is a fascination with breast milk as a form of medicine in Chinese society. And I think it has a lot to do with this Victorian imagination of as China as this milkless place, and also the land of like perverts, right? Let's just be honest. But if you look at medical texts, which is kind of how I sort of came into this topic, there's a lot of formulas for increasing milk production. I think the lack of milk is always a problem for any nursing mother. There's also, one of the first things that I came across actually is a formula from about the time of Jesus from the Northwest, where you have formulas to relieve engorgement of breast, so too much milk. And I remember when I was reading it, I was just pregnant. I thought, how could you ever have too much breast milk? And then 10 months later, I found out what this condition was. So this is actually an area that I think is worth investigating in greater depth. This is medicines that are used, things like ginger, for example, to help regulate breast milk production. So I do think that, upper class families definitely make use of wet nurses. And this is something that goes out the door in the 20th century as they talk about the dirtiness of the wet made as the wet nurses, which I know is also a problem in the United States and in the English world as well, around the same time. But there definitely is lots of treatments, which suggests that there may be more breastfeeding than we realize, or maybe sort of concern for the sort of milk production of the wet nurses themselves in these elite families.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but Chonggao, if you could ask your question and make your comment very briefly, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the interesting story sharing by Miranda. Okay, I just want to have a very short question about the consumption of other milk. Okay, as far as I know, in some places people also consume the milk of horse or milk of the water buffalo, something like that. Because in the presentation, we hear the story of the consumption of the goat milk. I just want to know whether the other options. Okay, thank you.
So again, it depends on period and context. So in cow's milk is preferred in early modern China in the coastal period places. So Matteo Ricci actually makes a point that in his period, in the 17th century, the Chinese are making cheese and drinking milk from cows and buffaloes, which are the same word in Italian, I think, as well as in Chinese, or the same general word, not sheep and goat. And that has kind of dropped out of the picture. There's a lot of interest, of course, in various forms of horse milk, which is quite fashionable, even in the Ming dynasty, oddly enough, after the Mongols are kicked out. So this is a thing. For medicine, I think cow's milk is considered better. Horse milk has other properties. And buffalo milk, obviously, especially if you're in the Yangzi Delta, the Pearl River valleys, sort of the thing to go, because, regular yellow cows don't do that well in that climate. So I think it's a function of place and time and then purpose.
I just want to add that in Shanda, the water buffalo milk is the best for making the Chinese cheese.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for fabulous papers. And I hope to get an opportunity to ask you the loads of questions that I have for you both. That's maybe at some other time. But I'm aware that we're running out of time now, so I'll leave it to Melissa and or Marta to make the final comments.
Sure, thanks. Thank you so much, Jakob, for sharing this first session of the seminar, and thanks to everyone for their questions. Thank you to the two speakers as well. I just wanted to let you know, and I'm going to put it in the chat very quickly, is that we've had to postpone the seminar that was scheduled for the 18th of February because of UCO industrial action. So there's a strike here in universities in Britain. And we're going to reschedule that for the 18th of March. So it should be easy to remember, at 5 p.m. So the actual next seminar will be on the 11th of March at 5 p.m. So slightly different time. So Veronica and Miranda, I hope you'll be able to join us. But thank you very much from London, Michigan, and Hong Kong. That was a great first start. Thank you.